As Democrat protesters continue to try to tear down monuments and rewrite history, something dawned on me this weekend about history that apparently hasn't dawned on them. So while they're going about this, perhaps they should add this to their list of things to attack from our past. In 1774, a group of protesters gathered on Boston Common was approached by British officers and men. The protesters were, of course, protesting government intrusion in their lives, and the British soldiers were there to guarantee order. In the absence of a police force, these soldiers were the de facto military police in the city, because police was not yet an institution that had been privatized and made a part of the government as of yet. The circumstances escalated. The British fired into the crowd. Several individuals were killed, including a black man, and John Adams defended the British at their trial. John Adams was very unpopular for a long time after this, which is a little bit ironic because he would serve as vice president and president, because in the course of the trial, all of the soldiers who had fired into the crowd were excused of any criminal doing, and the officer in charge received minor punishment. And so it's a little bit interesting to look at the riots that we have today and make this historical comparison. And I've identified 3 points that I'd like to make about the protests that we have now versus the protests in the past. So the first parallelism, or perhaps anti-parallel point here, is the reason why the protesters were gathered. The individuals who have been protesting nationwide have been protesting police brutality. They have been protesting government inaction to correct the bad behavior or perceived bad behavior. Back then, in 1774, guns were perhaps as more common among the populace. If you don't believe me, go read Clayton Kramer's book on the subject, A History of Firearms in America, because guns were actually more prolific in terms of per capita availability than they are today. Secondly, the groups that were protesting, the protests we have now are protesting cops shooting criminals. The protest in 1774, there had been no killing of anyone until the British fired into the crowd. And there was no claim to defund the military or disarm the soldiers, because the people of the Americas at the time understood that the soldiers were sort of a necessary evil, because the colonists were not allowed to have their own standing armies, nor were they particularly equipped or trained or responsive to that. In fact, until after the Revolution, there was really no general movement in the Americas to establish either a fire or police department in any way, shape, or form, and this was a behavior left at the time to the military. So imagine, if you will, had the military been called out to respond to these riots, and imagine, God forbid, if they had fired into the crowds. Secondly, the protests both involved the shooting of black people. In the first case, in 1774, there was a free black man, Crispus Attucks, who was hit by one of the balls when the British soldiers discharged their weapons. And he, of course, was killed and was made a poster boy martyr. Not to the same ends. In the latter case, today, we have alleged criminals killed in the middle of an alleged crime, and then the cops are being excoriated for shooting an unarmed black man. Now, the rioters at both of these historical events were armed. They were not armed in the same fashion as those who discharged firearms into the crowd, but there were Molotov cocktails, stones, bottles, rocks, sticks, clubs, canes, whatever, fists. Ernest P. Worrell once in one of his movies said, "If I put my fist in my pocket, I'll be arrested for concealing a dangerous weapon." Yeah, for hiding a concealed weapon. So you don't need a weapon to fight back. It helps if there are guns involved. But in both of these cases, they were both armed, and black people were killed. And the outcry in Boston was not over a black man being killed. It was, at the time, it didn't matter what his color were. It was Bostonians had been murdered by the British. And that was actually how the paper phrased it, because it wasn't pitting the army against the people or the police against the people. It was pitting a government against the people. And at no point do I remember anyone pointing out that this is somehow the federal government's inability to act, because the federal government doesn't control the police. Thirdly, the trials. In the case of both 1774 and the trials involving the police in 2020, with rare exception, almost all of the shooters have been exonerated of charges. And when charges have stuck, they have been minor, which of course then yields today to more rioting and looting, because it's about justice. And I'm sure in 1774 that people were just as frustrated because some soldiers who were foreigners, today they would have been illegal aliens, had murdered residents of their own city. See, back then it was you killed some of us. It wasn't cops hate black people or cops hate it was, you took this out on our people. That this was the colonies versus the mother country. That what are we, second-class citizens? Well, are we all second-class citizens? And it had nothing to do with the color of their skin. But also that the lawyers were able to get them off in both cases. And it's a very interesting thing. And I haven't heard anyone else make this point or make this comparison, because the same thing happened 250 years ago to nary a word in the interim, to nary a balkanization of the people. The colonists were still together as one, and the mother country was together as another. But now it's, well, cops are shooting black people. And it's interesting if you look back at shooting incidents back during the revolutionary times, just how many black men were actually murdered, how many black men were present, and how that didn't become a thing until the civil rights movement, because there were free blacks for a long time. I've been to Lexington and Concord only once, and I was there for the historical relevancy, and there's a monument there, and if you go inside I guess it's the tavern on the far end of the green from where the militia were standing, there's some sort of a narrative about the individuals there and what we've learned about them. And it turns out that one of the men who was there, named Prince Estabrook, was a free black man from Connecticut, I think. Connecticut or Rhode Island. And in any case, he wasn't from Boston. He wasn't from Lexington. He wasn't from Concord. He wasn't from the region. He was there on a visit, and he was black, and he was gunned down. He's one of the men who was killed on the green. But this was never used as a predilection to call up some sort of a race-baiting, racism intolerance. In fact, if any racism was thrown out, it was, we hate the British because their army's full of Irishmen, which was white people hating other white people. And yet here we have our riots today, which are very much the same as before, being manipulated in the media to serve a different purpose, because that's really what this is. The facts of the matter, both in 1774 and today, are that cops and soldiers may have stepped over the line, but it wasn't murder, it wasn't intended, it wasn't cold-blooded, and it certainly wasn't first degree. Does that mean they should get off without any consequences? Absolutely not. Because people were killed, and there must be a consequence when people are killed, especially when men with guns stand up against men without them. Because once guns are brought to bear, there's an inequity. And so the people who were shot at definitely have a cause for action in order to make things right. I don't know what the right thing is. In Korea, they make you pay sorry money, and it's like a lot, to where it would bankrupt you. But it doesn't fix anything, and it doesn't bring your loved one back from the dead, and calling out for justice after the court has spoken just riles up emotions and makes people angry and hate other people for no good reason. And it's taken us 250 years, maybe less, but we've forgotten and forgiven the soldiers who gunned down our own citizens in the Boston Common. And almost everyone in this country has totally forgotten, even if they ever knew, that one of them was black. It's something that we were taught in high school and then we never think of again, because the race of the person didn't matter. It was Americans who were targeted. And that's what it ought to be today, is if cops are shooting people, they're shooting Americans, they're shooting us. If they're shooting us without cause, then it doesn't matter how many they shoot or who we are or what we look like. But if they were shooting people who were criminals, if mistakes were made, if it wasn't intentional, then then two rights don't make a wrong, and it won't heal anything to demand a pound of flesh in exchange for a pound of flesh. An eye for an eye does truly make the whole world blind eventually. But if you think about those historical events versus now, they were being manipulated by the media then, as ours are being manipulated now in order to achieve a social end. And I wonder sometimes how Crispus Attucks and George Floyd would feel about how and what is being done with their names. Would they approve of how history has treated their memory? And what can we learn moving forward about coming together and about forgiving and letting things go? If you have been affected by this, then of course I understand that you are hurt and you feel robbed. I've lost those that I've loved. Not that way, not for those reasons. But losing a loved one sucks, no matter how it comes, no matter why it happens, no matter who you are. And that's what we have to keep in mind here, is that we're people. And that when you mess with one of us, you mess with all of us, one way or another. And that's why it's so important, more than ever before, to love God and love one another, to take good care of each other, to reach out for, to check in on, and have each other's backs. Because the things that we do really do affect other people's lives, sometimes in unseen ways, and sometimes for generations to come. And it may be 250 years before history forgets George Floyd, only because there'll be some other person abused in the name of social movements in order to achieve an end that has nothing of benefit for those most affected. So if you have those in your life that you love, go and love them. And if there are people you don't love, try and find a reason to love them. If you can't find one, maybe the problem is in you. Godspeed and take care.